Okay, everybody, we are here at the Tel Dan Gate Complex, and you can see it's a pretty impressive location. But I tried to bring you here and get you here at Dan because, number one, I knew there were some shade trees here. Amen, right? We like that. And so we knew they were there, but also some very important things happen right here in this gate complex. The city of Dan is first mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 14:14, and it's in the life of Abraham, dealing with Abraham. The city of Dan is mentioned there, but back in those days, it really wasn't called Dan. The name of the city was Laish. Now, let me help you understand this. Who is Dan anyway? Dan was one of the sons of Jacob. Okay, you remember Jacob? Who was Jacob's name later on? Israel. So if he was the son of Jacob, he was one of the tribes of Israel, right? And so this was his allotment up in the north. It was part of the allotment of Dan in the book of Joshua and the settlement in the book of Judges. And so it was called Dan at that time. In the book of Genesis, however, Dan had not yet been born. Okay, that makes sense? And so somewhere back in time as the Bible was being copied, somebody who was Israelite knew that story and knew that the city was Laish. And so when they were copying it, they said, nobody's going to know Laish. That was 1,000 years ago. We're going to change it. And so they just put the name Dan. But it's still the same place. And so we're at the farthest northern regions of Israel. In the Bible, you hear them say quite often, they went from Dan to Beersheba, right? You hear that phrase quite a bit. Beersheba is in the south just before you go into the desert. Dan is in the north just before you go over to Assyria. And so it meant basically from top to bottom in Israel. And that's where you are. You're here at Dan. Dan is an old city, an ancient city. It predates Abraham. Abraham would have known of this city. He came to this city. He fought here. When he was coming from Haran, when he came from the north country, he would have come through here. We're going to possibly... I don't know if we'll have time today. This place is pretty big and spread out, as you can already tell. But there's another gate complex on the back side of this place that dates to the day of Abraham. It's a mud brick gate, arched gateway. But again, it's quite a hike, and we don't want to make you walk so far for that. But it's a great gate complex, and it would have been there during the time of Abraham. And so this city is significant in the Old Testament. Today, you're getting a dose of Old Testament stuff, which is my favorite. I mean, I love Jesus. I'm a Jesus follower, right? But I really do love the Old Testament and love the Hebrew Bible. So here we are at Dan. It has this ancient history all the way back before Abraham was. And now we're standing here and you're looking at a gate complex that's probably that old. This is ancient as Abraham. Now, you got to understand that a lot of this has been restored. The big, huge rock walls, those are restorations, but they're doing it based off of research. They didn't just throw it together and hope it's right. They did archaeology. The land used to look just like it does up on top of this hill. If you look at some of these hills, it was just grown over. But archaeologists came here. An archaeologist by the name of Avraham Baran. He's one of the founding fathers of the archaeological school there in Hebrew University. He's one of the guys, he just died recently, but he was a dear old man. You can read him when you study about him and know him when he died. He just had this great heart for the Bible and for the Jewish people, the Israeli people. And he came here and he spent his entire career here at Dan digging. And so he began to dig and just wonderful things he found. So I want to explain a few of those things to you. Behind you, when you first came up, I don't know if you noticed, but when we leave, there's a little podium right here. A podium that would have had a top to it. You'll see at the square podium there, you'll see some bases, some round bases that have a hole, looks like a vase in the middle. That is not a vase. What it is to hold a pole that would go up to the top, and there would be a covering there. On the podium, the king would come down from the city, and he would sit there in this podium, and the people from the lower regions or from outside the gates, they would come and meet the king in the gate. And so, ladies, you've heard Proverbs 31, and her husband is admired sitting in the gate. Those people who come to the gate complex. So we're not talking about just a door that they would walk through. This gate complex helps you see and understand what that phrasing in the Old Testament is, and they would sit in the gate with the elders. So the elders of the city, the king of the city would come and sit right there, and they would hear cases. Somebody stole some land, somebody stole a sheep, somebody stole a goat or something, and they would want to bring it before the king, and he would come and sit right there. And he would listen to those cases, and he would listen to them, and he would make decisions. And the elders would sit around in this complex. And if somebody had a grievance, they would come here and decide that. So it was kind of like a city center where everybody met together to talk politics, to talk city stuff happening. And so this is a very important part of a city. And unless you ever see something like this, you'll read that, and he sat in the gate. You say, what does that even mean? He sat in the doorway? What exactly does that mean? Well, here's what it means. This was the gathering place where the aristocrats and the rulers would come and meet with the city. And so I thought it was cool that you could see that, and we could talk about that here. So before we leave, make sure you look at that complex, make some that podium, make some pictures of that, because it's a cool place. Now think about this. As you're an ancient traveler, you're traveling and you come to Dan and you walk up this big stairwell. Wouldn't that be impressive? It is meant to inspire you and to instill awe in you as you come up to this city. So that's a wonderful thing there. The gate on the back side is a wonderful gate. Go read about that. Get on the internet and study that. You'll love to see that too. But again, it's just so far a walk. We're not going to do that today. But the gate is there. This gate is wonderful. But now I want to tell you something about something even more special about this place. In the early 70s, when we were at Hatzor, in the early 70s, I told you about at Hatzor that there was a group called the Minimalists. They're known as the Minimalists now. In the early 1970s, they began to cry out that, Israel is not historical to the 9th century BC. There's nothing historical. There may have been a family story that Moses gathered, might have been a family story that Joshua gathered, and there might be some historical kernels of truth, but there's nothing in the Bible outside the Bible, extra biblical, about David. There was nothing ever written about David in the Bible. Nothing written about Solomon much. There's nothing written about Saul, any of the previous rulers and the judges. Nothing at all. And so the minimalists began this, I call it a campaign, to rid the Bible of its historical moorings. And starting in about 1974, a lot of books were written in this minimalist idea. They don't like to be called minimalist, but that's the name that has stuck. I didn't call them that, but that's the name that stuck to them. And until 1993 or so, there was nothing. And they had been screaming now for 20 years, right? There is no history, there is no history, there is no history, there is no history. Evangelicals had gone off in this realm of study in the Old Testament called the Bible as literature. Have you ever heard that movement? What we found out in the 70s with Robert Alter, he called for us looking the Bible as literature. Okay, there's a lot of controversy in the history stuff. And let's just talk about the literature. What are about the characters and the narration and the narrators and all the narrative features and the flow and the poetry and the genres and such. And so evangelicals found that they could communicate in that world with the scholars from all over the world, and they wouldn't have to battle. So we as evangelicals, we kind of settled into that easy spot, talking about the literature, and kind of ignored history. We as evangelicals have always accepted the historical moorings of the Bible. We just accept it as fact. But we kind of got off, as scholars, got off into this world of literature, okay, and just kind of left. And by 1985, we had just basically left these historical studies. There's a gap between 1970s up to till about the 2002 or so that nobody talked about the history of Israel, just in some small articles. There was no talk about the history. It was all about literature. But guess who was talking about the history? The minimalists. There was this void, this vacuum of talking about historical studies, and these minimalists were screaming loudly. One guy even had, I'm not going to call his name, but one guy had a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. Israel didn't have a history. Israel doesn't have a history. It's not historical. Well, they were digging here at Dan in 1993. And it was late one afternoon, and they were here in this gate complex somewhere in this vicinity. I'm not sure exactly where, but somewhere right in this vicinity. And it was time to go home in the afternoon. And one of the persons who does all the writing, does all the transcribing, all the copying of the numbers and stuff here, her name was Gila Cook. She was walking at this complex to go get on the bus to go back to probably Kiryat Shimona. That's where they stayed, I think. And so they were going there, And she noticed as she walked by the wall, all of a sudden there was a little glimmer, and she noticed it looked like something was writing on a stone. And she stopped and she brushed it off and looked at it, and she run to get Dr. Baran, and she said, "There's an inscription, there's an inscription." And it just so happened, now think about this, folks, I think this is God's intervention. It just so happened that she was walking by this wall at the right time where the sun hit this rock just perfectly. They had been walking past that wall probably for days. If the wall, just think about it, if the wall was this tall, how long do you think it took in an archaeological dig to go from here to the ground? It takes quite a long time. Most of the time, it might even be a dig season. And so they had walked right beside this wall time and time and time again. Minimalists were screaming, "There is no history, there is no history." She sees this inscription. The next day, they come and they take the wall down piece by piece, and it's a small rock with inscriptions on it, writings on it. You'll see it on this board right here in front of me. It took some time to get it deciphered, translated, but they did that. And it says this, that I am the king Hadad, somewhere from Syria, over Syria, and I have come come to Tel Dan, and I've come to Tel Dan, and I have destroyed this city. I've conquered its king, who is of the house of, guess, David. And so this king from Syria came down here, conquered this city, is what he thought. He conquered the city, he won the city. And he said this king who is king here was of the house of David. So all of a sudden, we go from not having any inscription about David, any mention of David, till that one find, we realize David is real. So the minimalists at this particular time, the minimalists start saying, "Oh, it doesn't mean house of David. It means house of uncle. It means house of this. It means house of something else." And they do all these grammatical gymnastics, and everybody in the world say, "You are not correct." And if I were in Alabama and I wasn't being videoed, I'd say more than that, right? You're just badly mistaken. Badly mistaken. It means house of David. Now, they also say, well, okay, they finally conceded and said, okay, well, maybe it does say house of David. But you know what? That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that David's kingdom was great. But let me ask you a question. How many towns are around about here? You just think about it, just in a normal setting, there's probably at least 10 or 12 towns around here. Why didn't the guy, the king Ben Hadad from up here in Syria, when he came down here and he conquered this town, why did he not say, I have conquered Dan, whose king is from the house of Kiryat Shemona? Because it was insignificant. Why would he have chosen the house of David? Why would you write that? This particular stone is part of what's called a stele, a monument stele, okay? It's written there to commemorate something. It's what we would see a memorial in our towns. Okay, you'd see a plaque that says this and this and this and this happened here. This stone was part of that. It had been broken in history and used to stack up the wall, make the wall. But why would this king, this Ben Hadad, come from Syria, conquer this town, and use the term house of David? Think about that for just a minute. Logically speaking, what good is it? Does that mean he's done something good or something insignificant? You would want to bolster what you've done, right? You would want to make it something significant. Hey, I have done something great. I have conquered Dan, which is of the house of David. Now, if David was insignificant and David's kingdom was nothing, he'd have said, hey, I've gone and conquered Dan, right? But so 1993, they found part of it. 1994, they found another part. And so now we have proof outside the Bible that David existed. And the argument now is, how big is David? How big was his kingdom? How big was the house of David? My contention is it had to be of some significance, or otherwise the king wouldn't use it, right? So that all happened here at Dan. That's here. The inscription was found right in this general area. You can see the gate. And so I brought you here and talked to you just to see, so you'd understand the significance of this great northern city of Dan.